All right, Bellringer fans, it's Wednesday. That means that today we have a book talk. And did I tell you I got worms? Yeah, let's do the Bellringer. All right. Hey now. Mr. Kovacs class. It's Mr. Kovacs class. You might learn a ton. It's Mr. Kovacs class.
It's interesting too.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
And he's super cool.
It's Mr. Kovacs class. Hey everybody, I got worms. Here they are. Look at these little cutie pies. Oh, there's one squirming. Wait, come on. What? They can hang on. Yeah, I got worms. Worms are animals, right? They're annelids. We know something about them. They're invertebrate annelids, members of the animal kingdom. They have some organs and organ systems that we've been studying. But we're also doing a lab where we're trying to study worm behavior. So in the lab, we want to know how worms respond to moisture. Of course, it's a lab, and so what you have to do is you have to come up with a question like something like, do worms like moisture? How do worms deal with excess moisture? And then you need to test to see how they deal with it. And you have to be able to measure things. And that's the key with today's lab. So I've got my worms, right? I've got moisture, and I've got a ruler. I could test the worms. Like I could measure something like how far does the worm move after he's been doused with a drop of water or something like that. And that would tell me how he responds to moisture, right? So we remember that from middle school as being controlled experiments where you have a question, a hypothesis. You set up an experiment where you have controlled variables, one independent variable, and one dependent variable. A little historical context, the guy that came up with the idea of controlled experiments, or at least the guy that got famous for doing it, was a guy named Francesco Redi. It was an Italian, fairly well-off Italian dude, but he was a scientist, or at least kind of a scientist. And his famous experiment showed that organisms couldn't spontaneously. People in his day thought that you get maggots if you left your meat out for too long, right? And they thought that maggots were like a punishment from the heavens that spontaneously grew out of the meat if you left it out for too long. He tried to prove that no, you only get maggots if you have flies that are able to have babies. Maggots grow into flies, and maggots are baby flies. And so he set this famous experiment where he had 3 jars. One was open, one was covered, and the other one was covered with some cheesecloth to allow air to get through. And what he found was, well, if you let the jar sit out, only the one that was open had maggots. The other 2 jars, no maggots, because the flies couldn't get in. All right, so that showed it was a controlled experiment. Right, he had 3 different jars with 3 different lids, okay? But the jars were all the same size. Inside each of the jars, he put the same kind of meat, the same size piece of meat, right? He left them out for the same amount of time. And then at the end, he counted something, maggots. Here there were none, there were none, and here there was a whole bunch, right? The first controlled experiment, that was Francesco Redi. So when you do your work with worms, you need to think, okay, what are we going to keep the same? What are we testing, and what are we going to measure? Right? We call those things variables. The independent variable is the thing that you're testing. The dependent variable is what you measure. And controlled is everything else that you keep the same variables. Is this starting to sound familiar, like middle school science where you learn about variables? So we're going to apply our idea of variables to worms, and we're trying to see if we can measure things about worm behavior in a controlled way. All right, let's get to the book talk. And there's Ed Puzzle and book talk, typical day.